Welcome back to this very beautiful site. For those of you who have missed me telling my name about 10 times yesterday, my name is Asher Kaufman and I'm the director of the Kroc Institute, which is part of the Keough School of Global Affairs. And before we move for our keynote speaker of the day, I would like to use this opportunity for our own promotions for Kroc and to invite Professor George Lopez to make a very short introduction to one of our great activities, outreach within the Summer Peace Institute that is run by Professor George Lopez. Please, George.
Asher, thank you. And in your registration materials, in your nice packet, you received a propaganda postcard. It's the one with all the people sitting in blue like a big team picture. Those are the tribe that comes from around the world for last year's Summer Institute in Peacebuilding. Quick commercial announcement. We are about to do the 12th Summer Institute in Peacebuilding in June 8th to 12th this year. It is a program conceived by many colleagues at Kroc for how we can be effective change agents in building peace studies programs in colleges and universities around the world. Our theory of change is that change comes from two or more faculty working hard with others on their campus to create a program, but that's often difficult to do in the context of your normal academic life. So we provide this kind of retreat, an active, we call it summer camp for faculty, where they get the fancy t-shirts, etc. And they get a chance to work together with some consultancy from many of us in Kroc in how you build an effective program. We're interested in two types of programs. People who are starting from scratch, don't have a clue what they're going to do with peace studies, but they've got some ideas. Or folks who have been doing peace studies for 2 decades and want to make some changes and go to a different level. We've worked with programs that want to adapt and create certificates within their PhD program. Dale Swernhardt from University of Toledo is the captain of that team from almost a decade ago, or folks that are just starting out. The international focus and participation has dramatically increased, and we try to keep the costs of this very low so people can come from different corners of the world. We know it's more likely from the US you can come with 2 or more faculty. We'll negotiate with folks from outside the boundaries of our geography if they can only send 1. One small note of what we're not. We are meant to be a curricular building workshop with a lot of good plenary and other sessions about those ideas. If you rightfully want to increase your own personal peace-building skills or to learn peace-building skills and interact with other professional peace builders, the Canadian School of Peacebuilding, Wendy, raise your hand, the coordinator of that great program, Wendy Croker, over there, or the, of course, good colleagues from Eastern Mennonite University run those kinds of programs. Hope to see some of you, hope to see all of you continue this fabulous peace work. Thank you, Asher.
Thank you very much, George. As I was walking up the podium here, I was reminded by one of the attendees here that today we celebrate the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Something to reflect about. Important day. Yes. So, as I'm sure you know, the Kroc Institute's Peace Accords Matrix is in charge of monitoring the implementation of the 2016 Peace Accord in Colombia. And PAM, the Peace Accords Matrix, is one of our largest research initiatives, research to policy initiatives. Our interest in Colombia goes well beyond PAM. We have graduate students from Colombia who study with us. We have non-Colombian graduate students who study Colombia. So it just made the perfect sense that we would want to have one of the keynote talks at this conference that would focus on Colombia. So I'm very pleased, I was very pleased when Sergio Jaramillo accepted my invitation to deliver this keynote address at the conference. Sergio Jaramillo is currently a senior advisor with the European Institute of Peace in Brussels. From 2012 to 2016, he served as High Commissioner for Peace for former Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos, the 2016 Nobel Peace Prize laureate. As National Security Advisor, he also led the secret negotiations with Colombia's largest guerrilla group, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC. As Peace Commissioner, Jaramillo also had to oversee the disarmament and the demobilization process of the FARC. Jaramillo has served in a wide array of government positions throughout his career, including as advisor to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in charge of Diplomacy for Peace program and political advisor at the Embassy of Colombia in France. In addition to his service in government, he was executive director of the Ideas for Peace Foundation. Jaramillo studied philosophy and Greek at the University of Toronto and at Oxford University, and he holds a master's in philosophy from the University of Cambridge and did postgraduate work in Greek at the University of Heidelberg. I mentioned that as I was reading his bio, I was really excited by his humanistic background. Some hope for humanistic actually studies and really promising careers that could come out of such training. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Jaramillo.
Well, thank you very much, Asher, for that kind introduction, but especially for inviting me today. When I got an email, really quite a long time ago, about the conference, I really thought I could not say no, because for me, this is not another conference. We Colombians have a huge debt of gratitude with the Kroc Institute for the work that it's doing in supporting the peace process, to Asher and to David in particular and his team, PAM, that is running this barometer of implementation, which, as we were discussing yesterday, has actually become even more important than we thought in this rather unstable times. And also because I have myself an even greater debt of gratitude with John Paul Lederach, from whose for his unending support and wisdom. I have to say that I have from no one else learned as much about what peace building means on the ground, and was a huge influence on me in particular during the whole of the negotiation. So I wish to dedicate this very modest lecture to him. So thinking about John Paul, I decided to speak today about the relation between peace and the imagination. And by that I mean the images, the narratives, the concepts, but above all, the visions that drive a peace process and a peace negotiation. Let me start with the very idea of the imagination itself. If my memory does not fail me, I lived in Germany for a long time, ages ago, but I remember reading a line of the great poet Hölderlin, who said somewhere or writes somewhere that for every 10 persons who can write, there's one that can think, and for every 10 persons that can think, there's only one that can use his imagination. And when you are facing a very long and protracted conflict, as Colombia was, a 50-year-old conflict, my definition of protracted conflict is a conflict that has actually become a way of life for everyone, that nobody can actually conceive of it changing. When you're in that situation, that very rare gift of the imagination becomes precious. And I want to start with John Paul's very definition of what he calls the moral imagination. And I quote, "The capacity to imagine something rooted in the challenges of the real world, yet capable of giving birth to that which does not yet exist." Without that capacity to see that things can be different, it is actually impossible to bring about change. But it's not simply the wish for things to be different, to be otherwise. I think there's much more to it. And let me use the example that was just mentioned of Germany. We are actually celebrating, yesterday and today, the fall of the Berlin Wall. By complete coincidence, I was myself living in Germany on the 9th of November of 1989. I remember it all very clearly, and I have an interest in this. So I was reading not so long ago the memoirs that 20 years later Helmut Kohl wrote of this period. And I found many lessons that apply to what I'm saying today. First thing that Kohl says is, when I look back at the years 1989, 1990, I must say none of that was self-evident. Selbstverständlich in German. A constellation of stars was needed to be in place for this to work. And what that means is things don't happen on their own. When you've actually been in the thick of things, of a very serious problem or a very serious historic situation, you tend to become, I have at any rate, a skeptic of historical necessity and possibly of historians in general who later on give you an explanation of why this happened and why it had to happen this way or that way. When you're actually in the thick of things, you realize things can go this way, they can go that way, unless people steer things in the right direction. And I think that's what Kohl was saying. But to do that, you need to have a vision of where you're going. And that's the second thing he says. He quotes this rather curious and peculiar 19th century phrase of Bismarck, which says, quote, "When the coat of history passes you by, you must jump at it and grab it by the tails," liberally translated. And by that, Kohl says that he means three things. The first is that you have to have a nose for the situation. You have to have the sense that things are happening. You have to identify the moment, which is precisely what President Santos did in 2010. He saw the potentiality of the moment. You also have to have the courage to jump at the opportunity and the intelligence of knowing how to do it. Only about 3 weeks after the wall fell, Kohl, on his own, presented his 10 points of what he thought needed to be done, very carefully thought through, so as to not to upset anybody, not to think that Germany was going to go its own way, working with our allies. But he had been thinking about this so much that when it happened, he knew what he had to do. And he could do all of this because, last point, but the most important point, because he had a vision. He had a vision that this was possible. He had already imagined this situation. And that actually seems to me to be, in a way, the essence of strategy. You have a vision, you work at, use whatever verb you like, shaping the space, preparing the field, constructing the scenario, and when things start falling into place, you push and you jump on them. And that description that Kohl gives of what happened in '89 is actually to me, exactly what happened in 2010, 11, 12 in Colombia, which does not mean that it's automatic, nor does it mean that you have to actually wait for the Berlin Wall to fall. Jointly with John Paul, but me in a much humbler way, I think we're fighting a joint fight against the idea of the ripe moment, the idea that unless everything is perfectly prepared and in place, you cannot actually negotiate. Of course, you can have very often conditions that make a negotiation impossible. Who would deny that? But I am very strongly against the idea of the ripe moment, and I think it's a very destructive idea because, first of all, you can actually actively help create the conditions that are going to make the negotiation possible. I'll give you one quick example. President Santos, when he won the elections in 2010, after having been Minister of Defense for 3.5 years, I was one of his deputies, and having been very hawkish about Venezuela, almost the first thing he did, 3 days after he won, was to sit with President Chavez and say, look, I'm now the president of Colombia, we have to behave as adults, what are we going to do? And he changed that relation. And he moved Chavez and Venezuela from being part of the problem to being part of the solution. So that condition that had made anything very difficult was now in place. So he actually was creating the ripe moment. Ripe moments don't fall from the sky. You actually work on them through various ways, including, has to be said in the case of Colombia, military means. Now, the definition that I read to you, the very eloquent definition of John Paul Lederach of the moral imagination, is rooted in the experience of communities on the ground that have suffered great violence, that have learned to be skeptical about easy change, about promises of peace, very common in Colombia, and that yet have the capacity to go beyond their own situation and to think they can have a different set of relations. And that strikes me as a very deep insight, rooted in deep experience, that is very important for peace building. I'll get back to that later on. But I would also add, and this is perhaps my only difference with Jean-Paul, I would also add that this is also true at a higher level of the negotiation process itself, which, by the way, without which you would not have the space to do peace building in the same manner. Certainly peace building, peace implementation, whatever you want to expression you want to choose, is the more arduous task than the negotiations, will take longer, may take generations, but as the Russian saying goes, negotiations are not a walk in the park either, at least not ours. They were extremely difficult. They took a very long time, 4.5 years in all, including 6 months of secret negotiations. And they also, and this is my point, they also needed to deploy something at least related to what Lederach calls the moral imagination. And by that, I don't mean simply that you need to, as in any negotiation, understand a bit what your counterpart is thinking, what his needs are, what his fears are. That's basic, of course. There's a good line of Kasparov, the great chess player, that he says, if you want to be a good chess player, you have to play 2 games at the same time, your own and the other guys. Well, that's how a negotiation works. But I don't think of the need to have enough of an imagination just in terms of your tactical needs in the negotiation. I think it's something much bigger. Because first of all, you actually have to defeat the project, the idea of the war that's in your opponent's mind, and put something else in place. And this, with the FARC, was extremely hard to do. And secondly, you also have to create a new narrative, a new vision that steers, that explains to your own people, to your citizens, where it is you are going. So that in effect, the way I would describe this is as a set, to use one of, again, of John Paul's favorite expressions, as a set of interlocking platforms or visions at different levels that feed off each other, and that actually, if you get things in the right place, constitute a kind of counterpoint that move things forward. If you find that a little bit abstract, let me try a few examples of how images, narratives, concepts drove the Colombian peace process and still do. When you start a peace process, the first thing you need to do, long before you actually start the actual negotiation, is you need to establish the right frame of reference. You need to frame the process. In our case, it meant acknowledging publicly, which President Santos did, both through statements, but in particular through a law known as the Victims' Law. We needed to acknowledge publicly that there was an internal armed conflict in Colombia. That was the frame, which, said that way, may seem like the most obvious thing, like an acknowledgement of reality. But it was not quite so simple, and it is never so simple with internal conflicts. By coincidence, I was reading recently a very good book by a Harvard professor, David Armitage, on the history of civil wars, where he shows how even in Roman times, the very idea of a civil war was absolutely problematic because it was contradictory. You were regarding another citizen, a civis, as your enemy. And that was in complete contradiction to the idea of the use of violence and of war. How could you be having an internal war? It undermines the political order. And that same logic persists still today. Governments on the whole don't like to acknowledge they have internal armed conflicts, especially democracies, because it seems to undermine their own legitimacy. Look at Northern Ireland, where the United Kingdom was always reluctant to acknowledge an internal armed conflict and decided to treat it as a problem of law enforcement, not only because of the use of force it wanted to deploy, but also for reasons of legitimacy. In the case of Colombia, however, unlike Northern Ireland, there have been for the past 30, 40 years, but especially over the last 20 years, major military operations launched, major operations of bombardment in our own territory under IHL. So legally, there was never a question that there was an internal armed conflict. And that was what, in repeated jurisprudence, our own constitutional court said. Otherwise, you could not be very well bombing your own citizens. Nevertheless, President Uribe always denied that there was, and denies to this day, that there was an armed conflict in Colombia. In part for those reasons of legitimacy, and it's a big discussion. Those of you who know about IHL and Protocol 2 know that there's a certain tension between your obligations under IHL and your rights as a state to impose and enforce the law. So you always have this tension between what I call the horizontal axis and the vertical axis. They are sort of always in tension. But it's also true that it's very convenient to deny you have an armed conflict, because when you say that the only thing that exists is the vertical axis and the government and you're a set of criminals, then happily I have nothing to answer for. It's all your problem. However, without that framework of the armed conflict, the negotiations simply would not have been possible for a number of reasons. First, because the whole logic of the negotiation from the FARC's point of view was a transition from arms to politics. And that transition only makes sense if what you're doing is moving out of the conflict into democratic politics. Secondly, that framework is also extremely important when you come to the very sensitive issues of justice, to the very difficult issues of determining what was legal or licit and what was not. So the armed conflict and international humanitarian law give you not the only, but the basic framework of reference for how you're going to treat the crimes that may have happened during the conflict. There is also naturally, just as important, the dignity that a negotiation done in those terms confers on the other side that allows them to actually move and negotiate, and they feel they're being treated seriously, which does not mean, which was always a big discussion in Colombia, does not mean that we as a government thought we were the equals of the FARC. It just means that that's how negotiation works. But when you treat it that way formally, and that's how it worked through all of those years, then the other side also feels it's been treated respectfully, and things move forward. And finally, that's where you get your public narrative from, your end, which I will get to next. You're ending the conflict. And it's with reference to that framework that you can do certain things on justice, which are different from what you would do in ordinary times, because you are transitioning out of the conflict. So you have to have a different standard. You can only have a different standard if you have a different frame of reference. And therefore, it was critical to make that move, which was made very early on, in late 2010-11, by President Santos. But it remains to this day a very contested subject. And a political party in Colombia has made it almost a part of its own identity to deny, to this day, despite everything that's happened, despite the fact that the FARC are no longer around, that there is no armed conflict in Colombia, and this played a role even in the referendum. So I'll move to the second example, which I just touched on, which was you need a new frame of reference, and you also need a new narrative. This was especially urgent for us because we had had 3 major failed peace processes, very long ones in the, as many of you may know, specialists, in the early mid-80s, in the early 90s, and the well-known process known by us as the Caguán between 1990 and 2002, which left everyone exhausted. And the fact is that peace had in Colombia by then, by 2000, still had something of a bad name, and that's actually quite a common thing. If you take a plane and go to Tel Aviv or Ramallah, you will find that nobody cheers for peace today very much, because everyone is exhausted. So you needed to change the narrative, you needed a new narrative, but you also needed a narrative that created space for the FARC to move. Now this is a point that seems to me to be severely underrated in Colombia, which is that the FARC was above all a military organization, a very disciplined military organization, very early on in the 1960s when it got going. From its very inception in 1966, they said, we are about taking power, la toma del poder. 10 years later, they thought they were strong enough to put together a plan, which they called their strategic plan, with a clear goal. And by 82, they said, we're now going to call ourselves an army of the people. And they were growing and growing. And people are usually impressed by the fact that militarily they grew, by the fact that they had all these terrible sources of finance, the horrendous kidnapping, the relation with the drugs. But actually, what one cannot lose sight of is that they were always a military organization going after a goal. And because that's what they were doing, they also condemned all peace negotiations, in my view, to failure, because they treated them tactically as spaces from which they could advance their plan. That's frankly what they were doing. And when you look at some of their internal documents, they confirm that. So if you get to a point, as it was the case in 2010, where they were much diminished militarily, but still pretty strong, they could have without a problem kept on going for a long time. And the fact that there are now sadly significant dissident groups shows you that it's not very difficult in Colombia to keep an armed group going. When you got to that point, you had to think, what is the narrative that they are going to transition into so that this historic goal they've been going after, and I must insist on this, The historic commander of the FARC, Marulanda, was an avid reader of Clausewitz. This is documented. And that's what he was going after. He had his goal. So what are you going to put in place of that goal? What's the narrative that's going to get them out? You need to think about that hard. What's your own narrative as a government? Because they had their narrative, which was impossible, which was a sort of a government plan of 10 points. But this move you really need to think about. When you talk to people who are today worrying about Afghanistan, for example, the more knowledgeable ones will tell you, look, it's really very, very difficult because the mullahs that are part or close to the Taliban tell them they can't negotiate, because if they do negotiate, they're going to lose their identity. They're going to go against what they're about. So unless you can find a new thing they can be about, you're not going to have any negotiation. So putting together this narrative was critical. And the new narrative we put together, simple again as it may sound, was called the end of the conflict. So not peace, but the end of the conflict. We worked this out in a framework agreement that we negotiated intensely in Havana over 5.5 months in 2012. The framework agreement is related to these ideas because it also became a kind of leading concept, a structuring concept of the negotiations, a roadmap that showed everyone clearly what we were going to do, showed us, the FARC, the Colombian people. And in that framework agreement already was the idea, in the first paragraph, that these negotiations were about ending the armed conflict and contributing to the building of peace, contributing. So there you already had, in a nutshell, the conceptual heart, if you like, of the whole peace process. And it had some very significant advantages. The first one was that it was a much more concrete thing than talking about peace in general. And when President Santos went public in September, 4th of September of 2012, and announced to the country we had a framework agreement, it was on the basis of something very concrete. People would say, for the first time, the FARC are ready to talk about their disarmament. This must be different. Perhaps this is serious. So it helped us with the credibility very significantly. At the same time, the narrative, I always insist on this, ended up defining what the process was about. So we said to the FARC, unless disarmament is on the agenda, we're not moving forward, and we had a big crisis during the secret talks over that point. But at the same time, we acknowledge that this process is not just about you disarming, because the end of the conflict means the end of the historic cycles of violence in Colombia, which need to be addressed. So for that reason, we are prepared to talk about other things. So whatever has a clear and direct relation with the idea of non-repetition, of non-recurrence of the conflict, we are prepared to talk about. So the narrative ended up defining the agenda and giving, in my view, strength and legitimacy and coherence, because it is, as we were discussing yesterday with the Croc, it is a self-reinforcing agenda. It's not a shopping list of things. You want this, I want that. No. It is a set of things that together were envisioned as what you need to do if you want to break the historic cycle of violence. And at the same time, it wasn't the historic demands of the FARC, which were what a socialist/Marxist government might want to do. We would say, well, look, that's what we want to do. You go into politics and propose that. But it certainly had enough in it so that FARC had space to move into something new, which was not just participating in politics, but saying, rightly, it was with me that the government agreed to do these things, as, for example, notably, a very ambitious rural reform program. At the same time, the other side of that coin is that to the Colombian people, we could say, this is not just about the FARC. It's also about you who have suffered the effects of the conflict. It's also about the victims. It's also about the campesinos. It's also about integration of the country. I'll get back to that point later. It was an agenda of 5 points For those of you who don't know, rule development, political participation, ending the conflict, meaning security plus DDR, the issue of drugs, and the issue of victims, which together, as I said a moment ago, created this comprehensive vision. But at the same time, we always said, this is about ending the conflict. Building peace is something much harder. Building peace is something that needs to be done by Colombians on the ground over a long period of time. We don't pretend that we're going to build peace in Havana. We don't pretend that by signing a peace agreement, we've reached peace. The hard work, as is so often said, but so quickly forgotten, is going to lie ahead. And the effect of this was very positive, because a lot of communities who were skeptical, rightly, recognized that they were being themselves recognized, they were being themselves acknowledged. Many of you know that in many areas of Colombia, yesterday we had a very interesting presentation about Montes de Maria. In an area like Montes de Maria, for decades, people have been working on peace-building projects in the middle of the conflict. Now the armed conflict is no longer there. They can do it with much more space. So by introducing this conceptual difference, we were showing these are actually different things. And it worked. My next example of leading concepts and ideas has to do with the great issue of victims. Not just justice, but of victims. Peace negotiations, as you who are the specialists know, are often criticized as being kind of elite affairs. We deal with the military matters, sit down in some room and sort things out among themselves. And there may be some truth to that. Shouldn't underestimate the difficulties of negotiating a ceasefire agreement and a disarmament. But it was very clear to us that we couldn't just do that, and we couldn't do it especially in the case of the victims. Because before even the secret talks began, the government had passed a law known in Colombia as the Victims Law, which established a very ambitious reparations program, by far the biggest reparations program in the world. And the issue of the victims was at the forefront of the national agenda. And it was there not just because the government with Congress passed that law, but it was a response to the strength of the victims movement in Colombia. So we said to the FARC, there is no way we can do a negotiation with you if the victims are not part of this. And we struggled for many weeks during the secret talks until we got a point on the agenda, so far as I know, for the first time in a peace agreement that is called Victims and Victims' Rights. I won't go into all the details of the very complex transitional justice architecture that was agreed to. I can answer questions about that if you're interested. I just want to reflect on the narrative and symbolic impact of the victims participating in the peace process. And I will use two examples. The one, some of you may know, or many may know, is the fact that we decided to invite the victims to participate directly in Havana in the talks. We had agreed with the FARC to a mechanism whereby every time we started discussing one of the 5 points in the agenda, each side could invite 2 experts to kind of create the right climate, throw out some ideas around. But when we got to this point, it was obvious that that was going to be insufficient. We had also agreed to organize conferences in Colombia where people could go with proposals to be sent to Havana. That was done for the previous point. But in this case, it also seemed to be insufficient, even though we did more conferences for the victims, 4 instead of 1. It still seemed it's somehow not enough. So we agreed to have 60 victims come to Havana in 5 delegations, chosen by the Catholic Church, the National University, and the UN, according to some criteria of pluralism. And they came and sat with us. And what I want to just try to put before you is this scene where you're sitting in a room, not much smaller than this one, and you have on one side the government delegation in front, the FARC delegation, heading the whole thing. On the other side of the rectangle, a bishop from the church and the international guarantors. And on the other side, 12 victims, each giving their testimony of what happened to them. If you think they were supposed also, and they did, make contributions in terms of proposals, what they liked and what they didn't, and what they expected. And we took all of that very seriously. But that, frankly, was not the most important thing, by far. The most important thing was the testimony they gave directly to the negotiators. So you had, for example, in the very first delegation, a lady called Constanza Turbay, from a family, the Turbays from Caquetá. Her brother, her elder brother, had been kidnapped and then killed in captivity in 1995. And 5 years later, in the middle of the Caguán process, her mother was driving down a road in the area where the peace process was taking place, along with her younger brother and a driver, and they were stopped by the FARC and shot on the spot, on the road, in the most violent way imaginable. And she had actually, since then, been living mostly in exile in Switzerland, and nevertheless agreed to come to Havana and talk about everything that happened in extraordinarily moving terms. And she said in the end that she was going to forgive them because she did not want to be a slave of her own hatred. And she wanted to overcome this. And similarly, with other victims, a lady I remember very well, because I had to deal with this tragic problem of the so-called false positives in Colombia, called Luz Marina Bernal, whose son, who had problems, intellectual capacity, was taken away and from the south of Bogota and found dead in northern Colombia, passed as a member of the FARC. In one of the more scandalous examples of the false positives, she also came, and she also gave her testimony. So this participation of the victims actually became something much bigger than we had anticipated. They ended up being somehow, for me, in the driver's seat of what was going on. It wasn't the government and the FARC. It was the victims saying what happened and what they expected now to happen. And they actually ended up becoming, I won't say all of them, because you can never speak about victims anywhere as a homogeneous group, the different opinions, and not everyone agrees, naturally, but a very significant number, especially those who went to Havana, ended up becoming the biggest supporters of the peace process because they knew what had happened to them, but also because they saw what happened in Havana. I remember one of them saying, a case I will mention in a second, a victim of Bojayá, saying, you know, when we went into that room, because people knew there were talks, but it's one thing to hear about talks, it's another thing to see them. And we went into that room and we saw this very solemn thing, and we saw the government standing up and the FARC standing up, and everyone treating us in such a respectful manner. We thought, this is serious. This may work. And they started sort of passing on the message. The other example of the victims I wanted to mention was the set of exercises of what we called public acknowledgements of responsibility, which unfortunately have not entirely, but have died down somehow in the last year and a half, but that actually got going in late 2015, even before the agreement was reached. By which I mean that those who are responsible for grievous crimes committed during the conflict should go forward and acknowledge their responsibility before the communities. Now, the interesting thing is that this idea that we had been thinking about, and which ended up being a chapter of the final agreement, you can find it at the very beginning of point 5 on victims, the communities themselves almost got ahead of us. So the community of Bojayá in Chocó, for those of you who don't know, Chocó is a departamento in western Colombia on the Pacific, by far the poorest area in Colombia, the most lacking in communications, big river, jungle, a lot of violence owing to drugs and the proximity of Panama and illegal mining. And so that community suffered a terrible massacre in the year 2002 when a FARC cylinder bomb landed on a church where they were hiding away, 80, mostly women and children, all killed. And it was a classic, utterly traumatic event. When you hear more details, it's even more traumatic. So people, a friend of mine, or a leader, remarkable reader called Leonard Palacios, who's become a friend of mine. I mean, his account of basically standing under a house but in the river with his young girl for sort of 36 hours waiting for things to pass and then coming out and so forth. Well, these people, they went on their own to Havana to talk to the FARC, to, in a way, bring them to account. And over the year 2015, they made a series of visits, and by the end of 2015, they were ready. And we agreed with the logistics and with the support of some others. A member of the FARC Secretariat went to the village of Bojaya in December of 2015 to acknowledge his responsibility. I went myself as peace commissioner and representative of the Colombian state to that same ceremony. And the most moving thing was that it was all organized by them. So they organized everything in front of the remnants of the destroyed church. And you must imagine this kind of tiny hamlet in what, for those of you who don't know, it could be sort of the jungly Mekong Delta or somewhere in West Africa or something like that. So they organized everything. They did not want the media to be present. They did not want this to be on the news programs in the evening. They choreographed the whole day, including an extraordinarily moving theater piece they put together about what had happened to them. And then they waited for the FARC to address them. And somebody recently said to me, Bojaya, I mean, it was really not so important. I mean, in the end, it was a mistake. The FARC are not, thinking like a lawyer. The FARC is only acknowledging mistake, is not really acknowledging that it had a policy of this or that. I mean, frankly, you can see this on YouTube. Pastor Alape, who's a secretariat member there, addressing this community, his voice was trembling all the time, facing them. And it's one of the most moving things I've ever lived through. So these things, in my view, the victims ended up filling more than anything else, more than even the idea of peace itself, the symbolic space of the peace process and driving it. And I think there's a big lesson for other places from that, from our own experience. For those of you who know, most do, what has happened between Israel and Palestine in their efforts at negotiations since Oslo, what strikes me is that almost anybody can parrot the agenda. Everyone says, oh yes, this is about borders, it's about security, it's about the refugees, it's about Jerusalem, and that's it, as if that's all they needed to discuss. And I was asking some people from both sides that have been involved over the years in negotiations, well, why do you think that's all you need to discuss? What about what happened? What about the harm that was done? What about people from either side acknowledging the harm that was done to the rest? Don't you think that could help start loosening things up, making a negotiation more viable? And I am convinced that actually that is true. And I think that the case of Israel-Palestine is a prime example of a place where we need John Paul Lederach's moral imagination to get to work. My last example, and I'll finish with that, of images and narratives, was the idea derived from the agenda that the peace process was also about territorial integration and of giving back to those who had suffered most from the conflict and who live in the Colombian periphery, which meant the obvious material things in terms of connectivity, roads, and so forth, but it also meant symbolically acknowledging them, creating spaces, giving them voice. We even agreed to create special electoral districts, which unfortunately the Congress has still not passed the the relevant law, to give them a presence at the heart of Colombian democracy. So in a way, it was now that we are celebrating the 30 years of the Berlin Wall, without much exaggeration, it was the same idea of reunification. In fact, in early 2016, late June, I went to one of the FARC camps, where the FARC were about to disarm, with the then Foreign Minister of Germany, Franz-Walter Steinmeier, who actually did his last trip as Foreign Minister was to Colombia. It was his last day on the job, second last day. He got on a plane on a Thursday, landed in Bogota. I took him, spent all day out in this camp, and then he came back, saw the president, went back to Germany, and he's now the president of Germany, as you know. But he talked about the German experience of reunification. But of course, to do reunification, you need to have a vision again of where you're going. And much as I admire actually the extraordinary efforts of the Germans, it is a very difficult thing. There's a good piece in, I think yesterday's New York Times, about how some people in East Germany are starting to now identify as East Germans, not as Germans, but as East Germans, because they feel that their past is not being acknowledged, because they feel that the narrative does not take into account what they were. It's the narrative of the West. So what we wanted to do was precisely not that, not get into a logic of what the center arrives at the periphery and tells everyone what to do, but to build from the bottom up. And if you go through the agreement, and nobody has gone through the agreement more than Kroc, but you will notice that every single point is crisscrossed by mechanisms to guarantee participation. And the best example of which are the rural development programs, which there are 16 massive rural development programs. They cover about 20% of Colombian territory. And they're built on the idea of so-called participatory planning. This actually, thank God, has actually happened. More than 200,000 people have actually participated in this process. And this is still going on. And it's going on because people feel acknowledged, people feel they have voice. It's been going on because it corresponds to what they thought should be done. In a conference about 5 years ago, I came up with a concept of what I call territorial peace, which to my amazement quickly took root and has currency even today. Somebody mentioned it yesterday in Monte de Maria. And it's not because I'm so brilliant or because it's such a brilliant idea. It's because actually that's what was going on. That's what people wanted to happen. And I must mention again that the ideas of Jean-Paul Lederach were very influential in thinking about how to put this together. Of course, there are a million problems. There are a million problems today as to how you do this, how the state relates, the state agencies relate with the communities. It's a learning process. But it's going on and is built around an idea that is carried by the people themselves. Now, somebody could say, and I will finish now, somebody could say, an outside observer could say, oh yes, it's all very well, but frankly, all those nice ideas crashed with the referendum of 2016, which you may know we lost by 0.3%. With very low turnout. 18% of Colombians decided the fate of the peace process, voted no. And subsequently, a government was elected whose political platform had been built on its opposition to the peace process. So what next? Well, certainly things have been much tougher than necessary. Some of the impetus went away, especially at the beginning. We have massive security challenges in Colombia in certain regions still. It's very varied. We have some dissident groups. Above all, we don't really have a shared public narrative today. But I will say what I used to say to my own team when we were facing a big crisis in the negotiations. I used to say to them, look, this is serious, but don't worry, because in the end, the peace process is bigger than all of us and will carry us through. And I still believe that to be the case today. That's where the idea of the platforms comes in again that I mentioned at the beginning. So we're listening yesterday to a conversation from the Monte de Maria, and they're talking about what they're doing, and they're talking about their wish to move forward with the territorial peace. And I've heard that actually from many others in other places. And you see that the Duque government has realized that these rural development programs are actually quite a good thing, and it's decided to support them, which wasn't obvious a year ago. So in the end, what I think you get is what I was describing as the self-reinforcing platforms. At the beginning, it was us from Havana, from a negotiation, putting these ideas out into the world, which anyway were built on things we knew the people were pushing for. And now it's the people themselves that are carrying this forward. That's what gives me optimism. That's where I think that things will keep to move forward despite all of the difficulties. Now, the missing piece is to create the joint narrative based on everything that's happening on the regions, based on everything that's happening with the various transitional justice programs and institutions, into a minimally shared narrative. That's not there, and that's the task I leave for the moral imagination of Jean-Paul Lederer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sergio.
Oh, yeah, nice to see you.
I think we have a few minutes for questions.
So if you want to ask a question, go ahead and raise your hand. We'll take a couple, and then we'll turn it back over to you. But before we take one from the audience live here, I wanted to ask one that's actually coming in from the live stream from Amanda Ripley. And her question for you is this: can you please share any insight about what work to demobilize individual guerrilla fighters over the years in Colombia and what the rest of the world could learn? And then I saw a hand over.
My name is Maria Koinova. I'm at Warwick University and work on diasporas and contested sovereignty. So you invoked in your speech the very emotional testimony, apparently, of the Swiss person who came to support the process. Yet there was a referendum, and I'm really interested about how the diaspora had an impact, and what is the view of the diaspora that we are seeking to think about how it may participate in peace process. Thank you.
Is there another question?
Maybe you can answer this too.
Okay, on the question of demobilization, well, there are two things. Previously, the Ministry of Defense used to run a program where FARC fighters could leave the FARC individually and reintegrate into society and get on with their lives if they hadn't committed serious crimes. But I think the more relevant question now, and very, very important question now, is why did the disarmament process and demobilization process work so well in Colombia? Because it actually worked impeccably. In 8 months, the FARC had fully disarmed to a rate that is very rare of 1 assault rifle per fighter. Now, apart from the very hard work we had to do, including my own office, I had tennis elbow for about a year afterwards because I had to literally sign 13,000 individual letters in a few weeks, certifying each fighter as a bona fide FARC member. And more importantly, the work that was done by the UN verification mission and everything around. The main point to understand is that the basic rule of the negotiation from the framework agreement on was that we were not going to repeat the mistakes of the past. I always say lessons learned exercises are a good thing, but the best thing is learn from your own mistakes. We're not going to repeat what happened in the past. We're not going to allow anybody to participate in politics while still under arms. So that's a basic condition. Because the elections were coming up, the FARC knew that unless they disarmed quickly, they would not be able to participate in the next electoral round, which was in 2018. So that's actually a good example of how process design and negotiation done carefully can lead to good results. On the question of diaspora, that's a very important question because there is a very large diaspora of Colombians here and in Europe and in other parts of Latin America. And the agreement itself contemplates a number of measures for those who have gone into exile. It has to be said that that whole world of Colombians in exile and much bigger still of internally displaced people who have in the agreement commitments to facilitate their return, that's one of the areas of the agreement, as our Croc friends should be able to tell you, that has been least implemented, which I find sad, because even though I understand that in many areas of the country today, or in some, it's not so easy to do, there are others where it is perfectly feasible and where more work needs to be done. But going back to the diaspora, the Truth Commission, for example, is doing a very serious exercise, and I find admirable, of sending people out to cities with large numbers of Colombians to establish chapters abroad. So Colombians Abroad is a special chapter of what the Truth Commission does. One of the members of the Truth Commission was in Brussels just last week. So that is actually working better. But I would fully agree that this is something that needs to be talked about more, because quite rightly people in exile feel that they are being forgotten about, and we need to put them back on the agenda.
Okay, I've got two questions here.
Jolyon Mitchell, University of Edinburgh. Thank you so much. I was very struck by your vivid description of the conversations that you had, the peace-building conversations. So my question emerges out of that and also out of what we were doing as you began speaking, which was eating together. And I wonder how important was eating together, food, for the peace-building process in Colombia?
You mean for the negotiations themselves? Should I take another question? Yeah.
Buenas tardes, soy Jenny Neme de Colombia y gracias por su presentación. Quisiera preguntar o tal vez pedir que hiciera referencia sobre el papel de los países garantes y el papel del país anfitrión, no solamente en las conversaciones, en el proceso de conversaciones, sino también su papel ahora en la implementación.
She's asking about the role of the countries that have supported the negotiations.
Okay, so the question of food, I take it as kind of an example of the big discussion of, as people say, building trust in a negotiation, which is a very interesting, possibly fascinating issue. I will say that we took, first of all, quite a conservative approach to this, partly because we were very influenced by the bad experiences of the past. So, for example, in the Caguán peace process, which lasted 3 years, and they were probably the worst 3 years of Colombia ever in terms of the level of violence, dead, massacres, and not a single substantive agreement was reached on anything. And yet, the government then thought it was a good idea to go around Europe with a delegation of government officials and members of the FARC Secretariat and tour European countries for a few months, literally, to sort of show them, supposedly, the FARC, what Scandinavian democracy looks like. And this is actually not a joke. That's what they did. And they would hang around hotels. And frankly, we thought, we're not going to do that. But more seriously, my own lesson is, First, that in a peace process, trust is built by actions, not words, by behavior. So to give you a simple but very important example, the fact that neither the government nor the FARC, in a country like Colombia, as media crazy as Colombia, the fact that neither side leaked the secret talks over 6 months, there was a leak at the very, very end, was always a sign that something serious is going on. These guys are respecting the rules, we are respecting the rules, both sides think, they're behaving seriously. That's an example of behavior creating trust. Now, and I can think of many others. The way we extracted the FARC commanders from the jungle with the ICRC, armed, took them to Havana, showed them we were being serious. At the same time, it's also true that you reach points in negotiation where you need to be able to speak more frankly, informally, try to understand a bit better what's going on, because the negotiation tables themselves tend to become too stiff quickly. So you start coming up with ideas of occasions to do that, either collectively or individually. I had my own channels, but we also with Humberto de la Calle, we established a system called the 2+2, then became 3+3. Top three guys from our side, we would meet in the house of the Norwegians in a kind of free conversation where you could say whatever you liked would be held against you. And then talking about food, the Norwegians themselves would organize every few months a kind of get-together in their very nice residence in Havana with drinks and food, and which at the beginning was, as you might imagine, a rather stiff affair, but as time went on and everyone gained more ownership of the peace process and of the fact that because it was designed really in what I call an incremental manner, after incrementally reaching agreements over a few years, you look back and you say, nobody's too keen to give up on this, and it does begin to look more like a so-called joint project, despite all the differences that remain, and you can more easily engage. And so it's a good thing, but I wouldn't do a peace process based on sitting around food or even less a glass of scotch. And on the issue of the guarantor countries, it's a very, very interesting thing, and which again is related to what had happened in Colombia in the past. In the process of Caguán, the government opened up. President Pastrana, in his speech, in his inauguration speech, I think it was, and if not then, almost immediately in '98, said, we need to internationalize peace, and invited really very many countries to participate in the negotiations. By the end, they had 20+ countries in a group of friends. And I have to say, I am very strongly against that kind of international participation, because it ends up creating a kind of sideshow that gives the impression that something's going on, because obviously, as soon as you invite somebody, out of their goodwill, they want to help, they want to do something, and so they turn up and they do things. But actually, nothing is happening in the negotiation, nothing at all. You could argue that, to a certain extent, with an extremely sensitive situation of Venezuela today, some of that is happening. A lot of diplomatic activity, but what's changing on the ground? So we went the opposite direction. We said no. And one of the rules that President Santos put from the very beginning was these talks are to be secret, the secret talks, but also to be held abroad and also direct. We don't want mediators. So we only wanted the minimal participation at the beginning, which was a host country and another country that had expertise in peace processes. In this case was Norway, host country was Cuba, to support this in a very interesting way, because they were not mediators, they were not, and by the way, I also, pet subject of mine, but I am, and I don't want to upset anybody, but I'm not a great fan of the word mediation. because it tends to give people the impression that they have the role of getting people to agree on something, that they are the agreement builders and makers, and I think that's a very bad thing. If you look at actually the history, I mentioned Israel-Palestine, if you read the memoirs of how things have worked, you can attribute a lot of the failures to mediation. The most important thing is you need the participants to assume responsibility for their own negotiation and to do it. So I much prefer the word facilitation to mediation. In our case, the way it was set up is that and that's actually interesting also from a so-called peace process design point of view, that many of the things we tried out during the secret phase, we then kind of formalized even more for the 4 years of the public phase. So with this, in this case, the rule was the two countries are to be in the room because they need to know what's going on, but they are not to intervene in the talks, so they could not offer an opinion, they couldn't say anything. They would just listen. But this setup, which looks like very conservative and stiff, was very effective. First because, especially the beginning is difficult. I mean, people are nervous, so the fact you have these two international countries present makes everyone behave a bit more, gives a sense of occasion, keeps things under control. And perhaps more importantly, on the few occasions where you have actually a really serious problem, big crisis, they know everything has been happening, they know everything has been going on, and that's where they can start facilitating, which meant, going and talking to one side, taking a message back to the other side, and moving around the problem. And not only just in the negotiations, we had a huge crisis in November of 2014 when the FARC kidnapped an army general, and we actually solved this problem through Havana using the instruments, the wherewithals that we had created in the negotiation. So we are hugely grateful to both Cuba and Norway, because without them this would not have worked, as simple as that. And they were extremely professional, both countries. It's very interesting because in principle you couldn't think of two countries that are more different than Cuba and Norway, but actually they're quite similar in some bizarre ways. They are sort of mid-sized countries. They have very professional diplomatic corps, and they got along. Thankfully, so that actually worked extremely well. Then when we went to the public phase, we opened up a bit, we invited some other countries, but it really remained a process that was accompanied by the Cubans and the Norwegians, to whom we should be forever thankful.
As you might expect that as an Israeli, I was struck by your comparisons to Israel-Palestine. It seems to be that the tangible parts of conflicts are always easier to address than the intangible parts, and the intangible parts are the ones that actually require moral imagination. So thank you for sharing with us your expertise, your experience, and thank you all for yet another very fascinating, participating in yet another very fascinating session of this conference. We are adjourned, at least for this session. Thanks.